Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Aisha Dixon, and I'm the director of the Emeriti Retiree Relations Center at UCLA. We are so glad to have you with us this afternoon. It's going to be a lively discussion, and we can't wait to get into this very important topic and kind of timely with the mayoral debate coming up in a couple weeks. It's a topic that's big on my heart. I do some volunteering down on Skid Row, so I'm definitely glad to hear about how we all can help support this amazing issue that's happening in LA and what we can do our part to support it. We are here with my colleagues, Michael Heafy from the Retirees Association and quite a few from the Emeriti Association. We do work hand in hand with our retiree and Emeriti associations. We are the on-campus liaison for everyone to ask questions, advocate on your behalf. So right now I'm going to mute everyone. So you don't have the option to unmute yourself until the very end, where I will open it up for Q&A. If you have a question, please feel free to type it into the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Michael Heafy. Oh, you're just on mute. There we go.
I know, I have to be more careful. Thank you, Aisha. Welcome, everyone, and especially my predecessor, Steve Cederbaum. Thank you for all the wonderful years that you've led this after-lunch lecture. It's a bit of an anomaly right now since we're not where we used to be, and that would be live at the Faculty Club. My name is Michael Heafy. I am the program chair for the Retirees Association, and I welcome you all. Today we have, as Aisha mentioned, a stimulating talk from Professor Dana Cuff, who is the leader and fomenter of cityLAB LA, and you can find their website very intriguing. I looked over that pretty well yesterday, which is how I came up with some of this background, and you guys are into so much. I couldn't believe the amount of work that you have, thank you, Aisha, put together since your inception. So Professor Cuff is both a researcher, an instructor, and has a BA in psychology and design from UC Santa Cruz, as well as a PhD in architecture from UC Berkeley. So the lady has got her chops. I want you to please help me welcome our guest speaker today, Dana Cuff. Please.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Aisha. And Aisha, thank you for your service and Skid Row. So important to have people working there when they can. And thanks so much for having me. We've been trying to do this. Michael and Stephen have been trying to set this up for a long time, and I appreciate your temerity in pursuing the topic, if not myself. It is very timely, and I'm afraid that we'll be able to say that in 5 years moving forward. Also, housing is probably, along with the environment, the key crisis that really points out the kinds of inequities that our society has produced and now turned into really severe social and economic problems. So we at cityLAB, as Michael was talking about, have a pretty wide range of ways that we leverage design in order to address spatial justice issues. But the one that's closest to me and where I spend most of my time is about affordable housing. So I have about 30 minutes of talk, and then I'm really hoping we have some time for question and answer, which is always my favorite part of a conversation. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and if anyone could tell me that it's working right, I'd appreciate it. Let me get the full. It's good practice for getting back into the classroom next week. Is that looking good?
Yeah. Perfect.
Great, thanks. So I want to share with you some background about the affordable housing crisis. I think we all kind of know how severe it is, but I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of what housing looks like, particularly in Los Angeles and California today. And then I'm going to show you some of the creative ways that UCLA and cityLAB in particular are beginning to address that. So here's the country about housing nationwide. And really, there's no state worse off than California. We have the highest share of households who are cost burdened, which is a definition that's used across the literature to mean that people are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. Before this talk, I checked into the most recent data, and it's kind of mind-blowing, frankly. If the median house price in California this year is already $863,000, in Los Angeles, it's an impossible $945,000. So thinking about making affordable housing in that context is a particularly difficult conundrum. We in California have 25% of the unhoused population of the country, even though we only have 12% of the nation's population. But as I mentioned, we not only have the highest percentage of cost-burdened households, but the highest rate of poverty. And that's largely because of the tremendous gap in income and income inequalities extensiveness in California, where we have extremely rich and extremely poor residents. Probably there's nowhere that's most apparent as with the homelessness crisis in the state and in our county. We just had a recent count in March, 69,144 unhoused residents. That's for sure an undercount. We have the highest number of unhoused residents in the United States in our state. And I think the data that is most meaningful to me is that every year we find housing of 21,000 housing units for unhoused residents, but almost 24,000 new unhoused residents join the streets each year. So even though we're providing a fair amount of beds and units, there are more and more people falling into homelessness each year. So the estimates are that we need 100,000 units of new housing each year to prevent further growth of unhoused population in the state of California alone. So, okay, how are we doing on the building front? Well, not so well. In the past, California has been a housing boom state. Even as recently as 1985, we were number 7 in the country in permits per capita. And given that we're a very populous state, that means we were building a lot of housing. But as you can see on this graph, by 2018, we'd fallen to number 37. And we can talk a little bit later about why that's the case. This basically means that, let's say, we need to rethink all aspects of why it is we're not building a sufficient supply of housing. One big reason, and that's particularly true in Los Angeles, is that most of our land, 3/4 of it, is zoned for single family homes. That jumps to almost 100% in places like San Jose. We have jobs outpacing housing supply, particularly in San Francisco. It's kind of the extreme case where there's 5 new jobs for every 1 unit of housing. That means 4 other households are competing for housing that doesn't exist already. And all of this means that we have what we're very aware of: statewide gentrification, displacement of lower income households. And if you follow that down, that means greater housing insecurity, people doubling up, people living in inadequate housing, like in garages, and then people falling into homelessness. So, where you begin to attack this problem is, of course, multiple, and I'll show you the different ways people are thinking about it. But from someone like myself who thinks about architecture and planning and building and the laws that govern that, which are extremely extensive, I'm especially interested in finding more land that we can use for housing. in California, planners who are surveyed say the top 4 constraints to building housing is land supply. Okay, that means there's not land available. Land configuration, meaning it's not big enough or it's difficult to build there. Land ownership and public opposition. Those are all kind of things that I see in my domain. That's the kind of work people in architecture and planning ought to be thinking about carefully. It's also a matter of cost of construction, and you've probably seen some experiments about 3D printed housing and new kinds of prefabricated technologies. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, but that's always an interesting kind of technological sorts of solutions that we definitely need to be exploring. And then, of course, the whole question about zoning, since more land is zoned for single family than for multifamily housing and every other use, industrial, commercial, retail, combined. So I'm known for saying that the single family zone is the most wasteful land use in the entire country. So we're not going to do it by building our way out, but that's one way. That's what we would call the production side. But there's a kind of accepted rule now that there's 3 Ps to making housing solutions to address the housing crisis: production, preservation, and protection. I think there's really 6 Ps, and these are the ones that I would name. We do have to produce more housing and more transformational types of housing. We have to be thinking outside the box, and that's what I'm going to show you in a minute about what ways to imagine housing our future. We need to protect against eviction and displacement and steep rent increase. We've done pretty well about that during the pandemic, but a lot of those protections are now being lifted, and we're going to see more people joining the unsheltered people on the sidewalks. We need to preserve all of the existing affordable housing. It's sometimes called NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, but really in California, nothing is natural about anything that's affordable. So it's better to think about it just as existing affordable housing. Partnerships among organizations that can address housing problems. Right now, it's extremely fragmented how our housing problems get solved. And until we get those basic organizations and institutions together, we're going to have an inefficient housing system. There isn't any way to do this without some form of public assistance, subsidies, services, vouchers. And that's what in Los Angeles, we passed Measure H and Measure HHH to provide permanently supportive housing. And those measures are actually quite successful despite the media. And lastly, we need political action, which is one of the ways that all of this kind of advocacy, as well as resistance to demolition and upscaling of housing, gets mobilized. So here's where I work in Perloff Hall. I founded cityLAB 16 years ago, and Michael's right, we've been incredibly productive, and we're doing it without university support. We bring in all of our own money through philanthropy. If any of you has a big pocket of cash somewhere and you need some place to put it, I can help you with that. I feel like we built this little organization on a light but strong model, which is the way architects think about structure at its best. And we now have 3 full-time employees besides myself. Well, I also am full-time faculty member, and we bring on board maybe 10 to 15 graduate and undergraduate students to work with us from all across campus. And we teach a curriculum called the Urban Humanities that was funded by the Mellon Foundation. That's been an extremely successful academic program. So since I don't think any of you are architects, or at least I didn't see you on the screen before, let me just start by what I think our assumptions about architecture are and how cityLAB and I am trying to radically rethink the architect's role into one where spatial justice is really a guiding goal. So we often think of design as a kind of artistic practice, and there's some amazing examples of this. And I am not invalidating any of this. I think, we could discuss the aesthetic agenda of our new LACMA building, but it's going to be a remarkable work of architecture, regardless of what else we think. There's also a long tradition in architecture of futurist thinking, kind of conceptual thinking, and cityLAB participates in this, but much of it, like this project by Archigram of a kind of plug-in city for the future of urbanism. This was in the 1960s, and you might imagine we didn't quite achieve this. That's also been a way to push people's imaginations forward, and I think it's a valuable part of the field. And then there's a kind of design that's data-driven. And for the most part, this has been a weaker part of architecture. We're not as evidentially based as we might have been. There have been periods in architecture's history when we've done better. But at least in industrial design, there's a long history of design as being very much ergonomically, in the case that you're seeing with Arne Jacobsen's work. But some of that goes beyond the body to think about how social organizations work. And there are plenty of ways to gather data. And at cityLAB, we very much, in part because we're based in the university, rely on data as evidence for making conceptual leaps in terms of thinking about the future of housing and the future of the city. So this is just one simple example. It was one of our initial projects at cityLAB, where we were trying to figure out how to do, where would be the sites for affordable housing. If we could just change one proposition or piece of legislation in LA, how much housing could we produce? And so looking around, you probably agree, there's a lot of surface parking. I can't remember how many square miles at the moment, but all of these black dots of confetti on the map on the right are surface parking areas, which could stay on the surface and we could build above it. And the project on the left was a proposal that was a demonstration or prototypical project to say, if we could rezone surface parking lots for housing of a certain density, we could produce a certain number of new units of housing, particularly if we didn't require new parking, or obviously you could excavate and keep parking if that was the priority. But without providing any new parking, we could get free land to build new housing. And as my colleague Donald Shoup has shown, parking produces traffic, not the other way around. So there's a new state legislation that's going to be on the books come January 1 that does not require a minimum number of parking units, as has been the case ever since our automobile-driven building code was put into place. So this is a radical shift, and this kind of research is a way of numerically assessing what the implications of that might mean. We call this projective research, which is a little contradictory to those who are in the sciences who mostly document empirical or positivist kinds of research of watching something that's existing and then modeling it and imagining what's going on or interpreting what's going on. For us, we use conventional and innovative research methods for studies that are expected to lead to desired future outcomes. And I can tell you that doesn't sound like research to the granting organizations all the time, because it seems like we're already formulating our results. And so there's an interesting contradiction as a researcher in this. Again, another matter we might discuss later. But projective research, I think, is one of the most important kinds of research that can still be done rigorously with deep evidence in thinking about crises like the environmental crises and the housing crises. So I'm just going to show you 3 projects. One of them is right here on campus, and it's called the Bruin Hub. One of them, and that one opened in 2021. This one, Backyard Homes, which has to do with ADUs or secondary units, was a 10-year project that ended in this little demonstration house that we built behind Broad in 2016. And the last one is one that's ongoing, but we just passed state legislation around this, called education workforce housing, which is looking at school land and seeing whether or not we could build affordable housing for our deeply needed teachers and education staff. So let me start with the Bruin Hub, and I'll just show a piece of a video. This was all research that we did at UCLA with our commuters, our extreme commuters on campus.
Is there any audio? Because we can't hear anything.
Can't hear any music.
Very quiet.
There's no talking on it. I can explain some of what's going on.
That's okay. We can hear the music now. Thank you.
This is really just showing, after a long series of ergonomic and focus group studies, how these pods, as we've called them, study pods, were fabricated and then, in fact, installed in Wooden Recreation Center. These are all cityLAB researchers that are in the video as well. So I'll show you what that looks like in Wooden now. Let's see if I can move that forward one more. Here we go. These are the kinds of research and data we gathered. We held focus groups. We asked long distance commuting students. Interestingly, our long distance commuters who have tended to feel left out of the UCLA community because of our important emphasis on a residential campus, we've tended to forget about those students who are unable to afford or for various reasons live on campus. This is a statistic that will surprise you. Nationwide, 73% of students are non-traditional, meaning they don't have parents that support their education. They don't go home during the summer. They're not single. They're not 19. They're not, right? They're everyone else. And UCLA is an amazing university because we welcome these non-traditional students to campus. But even with our 100% housing goal that we expect to reach, there's a big group that we call left out and priced out of the students. And most of our long distance commuting students are in that group. They overlap pretty neatly with housing insecure students. And so we're really dealing with some of the most vulnerable students on campus, and they're overrepresented in terms of students of color. So we're actually addressing through the Bruin Hub, the exact population we were hoping to meet and that the university has been hoping to meet the needs of through alternative and more creative means. So this is a squash court, at a former squash court in Wooden, underutilized, and we took it over and redesigned it in a way that destigmatized students who need everything from a couple of hours of napping place to an overnight stay. And what we had found with the commuting students is that they come to campus at like 6 in the morning and don't leave till 11 at night. in order to keep their commutes to 60 minutes instead of 2 hours. So they're kind of a heroic group of students in my mind, and very much deserving of our thoughtful attention to meeting their needs so that they can become successful students like the more traditional students that are housed in the dorms. We're gathering data about these students, and we actually have 2 more sites that we're implementing on campus, slightly varied, in the next 6 months. It's very well utilized. So let me tell you about, let me just check my time. The second project, which is one that we called Backyard Homes. And this is the one, as I mentioned, it took 10 years. If I take 10 years to do each research project, I'm going to die before I get the next one done. So I'm hoping to speed that process up, as you might imagine. We learned a lot from doing this work, and it was complicated work. We were looking at the various types of single family lots in Los Angeles. We started in Pacoima, where they have something called agricultural lots. They're 50 feet wide and as much as 350 feet deep. People had an amazing array of secondary income sources: car repair, appliance repair, gardening, and they had built, let's see, can you see my cursor? Yeah.
Yes.
So here's a lot that's empty or has just one building on it. Here's a lot that has 1, 2, 3, 4 additional accessory units. This one has 2 others. All of these are illegal because they weren't legislatively allowed until after cityLAB and a group at Berkeley, working independently at first, did enough research to write new California legislation. So we did a lot of data collection here also, went to community meetings. Interestingly, at the community meetings, most people publicly voiced antagonism towards secondary units in their neighborhood, didn't matter which neighborhood we were in. And afterwards, there'd be a line of individuals who'd come up to me, same people who'd voiced antagonism, and say, how can I build one? So it seemed to me an interesting contradiction that it was kind of a neighborhood problem rather than a neighbor problem. And we started to unpack that. We looked at those neighborhoods, which is the middle data, doing field surveys of how many already had informal or illegal secondary units, and it was as high as 67%. Now, maybe you'd say, if people can do it illegally, what's the problem? Just let them continue. There's 2 problems with that. A, there's no building inspection there. So some of these units were not safe, and they were exploitative of the renters who were living there. And B, as important as anything else, these were mostly in low-income neighborhoods with a higher proportion of residents of color, and they were not able to realize the wealth built into having a second unit because you couldn't list it legally if you exchange your property. Is that clear? I'm looking at Michael. If you're nodding, okay, great. Thank you, Jean, also. And the last is just looking at materials. We were trying to look at environmental materials that would be light and strong, and maybe we could take them down and recycle them and put them in another person's lot when their interest was done. One of the things we discovered was that everyone has a backyard home story, and I suspect you can imagine your own. If you had a space or a garage and you could convert it, there would be a real need for it, either for new income or nannies or caregivers or children who are returning who would be nicer having outdoors. So everyone basically could use an extra unit on their property. And in 2016, made into law in 2017, we wrote legislation with Assemblyman Richard Bloom that was passed in Sacramento that has basically ended single family zoning in the state of California, which I'm very proud about and has also made me a somewhat controversial character. It means that almost every lot in California that has one house can have a rental unit behind. No one has to build them, but everyone's able to build one. This doesn't apply to people on hillsides where fire issues actually take precedence, but in most of the state of California. One of our principal ways of accomplishing this was to remove the parking requirement in the close proximity areas that are within 500 feet of a frequent bus stop. Turns out, despite our sprawl, 85% of the single family lots are within 500 feet of a pretty high frequency bus. And that bus service only gets more frequent when you have more people living around it. So one of the things we discovered, however, in the Backyard Homes project was that we couldn't guarantee affordability. While the data now shows that there have been a sharp increase in building permits, number of units constructed, Los Angeles by far more than any other jurisdiction. And I think that's because we wrote the law. So we really understood Los Angeles's building fabric and knew how to write the legislation so that secondary units were possible. But we have found through further research that only slight reductions in rent are associated with secondary units. They're slightly less expensive per square foot, but basically it's just more housing. That's good in the production, but it's not guaranteed affordable because it's all built by private individuals. So with that in mind, we started the third and final project that I'll tell you about, and this is called Education Workforce Housing. We were looking for land that we could guarantee affordability, but that had excess capacity, kind of like a lot of people's backyards. Like, where is that in California? And we did what looked like a quadrant study that a biologist would do of land in California and drew an arc through regions across the Los Angeles landscape. And where that arc hit open land, we said, what is that? How common is it? How much more of that is there? Is that capacity that could have housing? And the land that we found most readily was school land. There are 150,000 acres of school land in California, distributed fairly, there's school land in every county in the entire state. And in every county in the entire state of California, there's underutilized school land in areas where housing costs exceed teachers' incomes, so that teachers are likely to be unable to afford to live in their own districts. And school districts have found they can't retain or recruit teachers because of this. So there was a clear need. Data showed us like that was the case. We did very extensive GIS analysis related to the way funding sources for affordable housing come to find that of the 150,000 acres, 75,000 were in fact what we called potentially developable land, meaning they had high housing costs, low teacher salaries, and excess capacity of open land, not classroom buildings, not fields, but land that could be built upon and not much lost. It would be a bus parking lot or a district storage building or parking areas, fields that have been abandoned long before. It turned out that there were, at the time of our writing the legislation, and now we're really aiming towards state legislation because we knew how successful that was to produce housing from our Backyard Homes project. 4 housing developments had been built, 5 total in the state, 4 of those in LAUSD. So we talked to the people who've done it successfully to find out what was so hard about it that made it so they were the only ones who succeeded. Turned out that 85 different projects had been attempted in more than 40 different school districts, and none of those had been able to reach construction. So we have lots of data about what the barriers and complications were. I'm not going to go into that, but we studied all the different sites, types of sites that were available, the types of housing that might work there. And as you can see, it's really beautiful housing that's built on the school lands that are in the examples. They all have waiting lists. Teachers are anxious to move here. If there aren't enough teachers, they're rented to the janitors, the cafeteria staff, the clerical workers. All of them have housing needs. The cost associated with retaining teachers is so great that it's really motivated districts to search for housing solutions for their educational and credentialed staff. And we just, and I mean just, earlier in September passed, again with Assemblyman Bloom, who deserves the credit, legislation that we authored to allow school land to be used for affordable housing for education workforce through various kinds of creative zoning and land use and building strategies. We think this is, we're now involved in something called the Education Workforce Housing Academy, where we're training districts to show them how to move through this legislation and through the entire process so that they can get housing built. And I'm just going to conclude by showing you my team. They're a pretty amazing group of staff members and graduate students. The top row is our staff that's full-time or close to it. Everyone below that line is a graduate or undergraduate student here at UCLA, and we take very seriously our responsibility to mentor students of color, and have had, you know, our students, the team members are really the next generation of cityLABers. So I'm very proud of the work they're doing, both with us and after us. Okay, I'm gonna unshare. See what your questions you're asking.
That was great. Thank you so much. I have a question. So are the labs there now on campus, the little pods?
Yep. If you go to Wooden, go upstairs and you'll see them in one of the squash courts, and you can reserve them. They're intended to be for long distance commuters, but no one really polices that. And in some ways it's better because it destigmatizes it. Anyone can use it, and it's like always pretty packed, especially around midterms and finals when students need late night sleep.
So
That is so cool. And there's more to come, you say?
Yeah, we have, you know, doing things like that at UCLA, you're all UCLA people, is a special kind of, requires a special kind of heroism from a big team, because it's not conventional, and the paths that have already been carved are the ones that are easiest at UCLA. So even just the color scheme caused a lot of people's hair to catch on fire in the UCLA admin. We kind of had a great team of people from Wooden, people from Student Services, the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs, like lots of people who backed up and were part of the decision making. So we're opening another one in Strathmore. You might have seen the Chancellor, or maybe it was Vice Chancellor Monroe Gordon, is opening up a basic needs center. This is like a post-pandemic issue that I'm really happy to see UCLA addressing. So we'll have 4 more pods there. We have 5 in Wooden, and we have 1 upstairs in my own building for the architecture students who stay here long hours. And we're opening up a version of this for theater, film, and television. Each one is a kind of experiment for a new user group. cityLAB isn't an architecture firm. We only kind of do demonstration projects, and then we hand off projects that come from that to other architects and builders. So all the ADU questions that come to us, I feed to young practices around the city, and they've gotten some good work out of it.
Wow, that's great. So we do have some questions. You are able to unmute yourself. I see Linda's hand up, your virtual hand.
Hi, yeah, thank you. That was great. Linda Baum retired from the Department of Pathology this last year. Yeah. I have a question. So and this is relevant to something I've also become involved with from a medical point of view, transplant. This actually might be something you would be interesting. Potential transplant recipients cannot get on the waiting list for a transplant unless they can demonstrate that they have 3 months of pre and post transplant housing.
Wow, wow.
And considering that I think about a third of the transplants in the country are done in California, that, I mean, the whole thing is crazy. So there are people who could get on the list who can't get on the list because they can't afford to stay here, even for 3 months, because they're still paying mortgage on the house in Nevada. Okay. So the challenge with that is that insurance will not consider housing part of the cost of the transplant. So that raises one question, which is there something to think about there? The second question I have, which relates, is the potential use of underutilized land on school sites, public school sites. Are there barriers, are there legislative barriers to school districts? You can hit the same thing. The school district is going to say, we're not in the housing business. And the housing folks are going to say, we can't build on school land. So can you address
How do we
that?
address that? Well, let me just say, the first problem you named is not one I knew about and is extremely interesting to me. We've just started working with some of our friends in the med school to think about health and housing. So I will put that on our agenda.
I don't think it's broadly known in the medical community either. It's a very niche thing for folks who approve transplants. So
I've been working informally with women's health collectives to try to find housing for abortion refugees, but it's not dissimilar from that, only much more extensive if it's a 6-month overall process.
It's 3 months pre and post, it balances out.
Crazy.
Linda, is that an insurance thing, or is that across the board no matter what insurance you have?
Oh, insurance will not pay for housing. Insurance
It's a transplant thing. It's required for transplant treatment.
Yes, it's required for the transplant. You have to be close enough that you can do very tight monitoring before the transplant and very tight monitoring after the transplant.
Wow.
But insurance will not pay for the housing, and you can't live in the hospital.
Yeah.
So it's a life or death matter, actually.
It is. It really is.
Well, we found that with people who are living unsheltered too, you know, their lifespans are something like 30 years shorter than people who are housed. With regard to the school land, you know, school boards and their admins and housing, you're exactly right. And you know, we don't want our school boards becoming housing developers. That's not, you know, they're working hard to manage schools. So it's always a partnership. And one of the things that our legislation does is, having studied both the school folks and the nonprofit housing developer folks, figured out the kind of ways to remove the barriers that kept them from being able to collaborate. So one was that it took 9 years to build, on average, to build the units that I showed you. And there's a school board every 3 years. So it took 3 different school boards to get through that. No, you know, that's just not feasible. So and nonprofit developers didn't want to touch it because there were no by right avenues. So we made it so that all school land is zoned for housing. That cuts about 2 years to 3 years out of the process. So you don't have to get a rezoning process undertaken. And we've guaranteed that any developer could build up to 3 stories. So they would know they could get certain densities so that their investment at the early side of a project would come to some kind of fruition that they could work out as being a feasible enterprise for them. So I think we'll see that we've made it so that many, many more school districts will be able to do this. We are also just now looking for, and have been asked to actually apply to take this program of school land for housing nationwide, because the problem of teachers not being able to afford to live in their districts is in every major city in the country.
Thank you.
If I could just say something about the transplant situation that Linda brought up. I know someone,
Cornelia?
yes, it is. I know someone who is part of a charitable group that provides some housing in Beverly Hills for post-transplant patients.
Yeah, Ava, it's called Ava's house, but they can only house
That's
20
it.
patients a
But
year.
it's probably a drop in the bucket to the need.
It's this
Yeah.
much. It's a private charity. She's wonderful. She does great work. They can house, she has 2 little houses. They can only house 20 families a year, given the time constraint. So
Right.
something that's built outside the box of a traditional house might be helpful.
Yeah, that's it. And of course, there's Tiverton House and so forth. I think that's part of the hospital. But I'm sure
Tiverton House
all
is
of
a
this is
hotel.
a drop in the bucket. I don't doubt that, but
Yeah.
I was impressed that there was something.
Yeah, we're Cedars. I won't, okay.
So
An institution down the street that I will not mention has said we aren't in the hotel business. So at least we have a hotel that people can pay for. So, and below market rates.
Well, Cedars is the place I go to now because it's near where I live, but I share some of your disdain.
The discussion is too niche.
It's
Yeah.
too niche.
So we have another question in the chat about what about opening those centers in the emergency room and medical center?
Yeah, talking about the Bruin Hub.
Yeah, the Bruin hubs.
Oh, yeah, no, I think the Bruin Hub model is very transportable. To me, this goes into this general idea that we need a broader continuum of accommodation, that we think of housing as having at its end state a single family detached dwelling or an apartment or a condominium. But really, there are plenty of other very dignified kinds of and destigmatized kinds of shelter or accommodation that we need to consider for various stages in the life cycle, problematic circumstances, temporary circumstances, flexible circumstances. And the Bruin Hub really stands in for those temporary and flexible circumstances that could work really well. I mean, look, I feel like I'm really lucky to be at the university where, you know, you wouldn't feel like you could prototype new housing types in just any context. I'd be wary of doing that with transplant patients, for example. But we can test them here and people can opt into them and really get our hands on some data for those students who opt into having their data collected and learn so much for other circumstances. So we're really using the university as a laboratory in a lot of ways around housing. And our housing services here are remarkable, actually. Very smart people, really looking for creative solutions.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, any other questions? I think, Michael, didn't you send in some questions? Do you want to go, or I see Steve's hand.
Let Steve go. I'm just putting mine in the chat right now.
But
Go
well,
ahead, Steve.
you know, Dana, I had some questions about this. For one thing, when you build a school housing, for example, you're also giving up open land. So like many social problems that we confront, we're often confronted with trade-offs.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that nothing is insoluble, but we always have to be cognizant of that. But a second thing is, I recall many years ago in the 70s and 80s when UCLA tried to construct housing, and the situation with Representative Katie Porter raises that. Universities build that housing, faculty move in and they're just delighted to be able to live near campus. And then when they find out how much money others are making from housing, and they're not making it because they don't gain anything from land appreciation, they're very resentful.
The university.
Yeah, no, the occupants are resentful that they lost out.
Yeah, yeah.
This.
Right.
And of course, that's a problem that we're going to confront. And
Well,
the final thing I was going to talk
okay, you have one more.
is that the solutions so far are just a drop in the bucket compared to the intensity of the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let me take them in reverse. The drop in the bucket, you still have to put the drop in.
Yeah.
And everything we do, we try to lay out as a prototype so it can be followed. I mean, I think the fact that it's state legislation and that we're taking it nationwide shows that it's not a drop. I mean,
Yeah.
we actually found that if everybody built a secondary unit, there'd be 8 million new units in backyard homes and 2.3 million units on school grounds. Now, if 20% of that happened, we'd meet our housing goals. So I'm not at all ashamed of putting forward the kinds of solutions that we're talking about here.
No, it wasn't meant to shame you.
Yeah, I know. The second thing about well, let me take on the question of school land, because like what we should use it for. You know, the history of school land, I don't know if anyone here is from the humanities, but the history of school land is fascinating. It turned out in the township model, 2 sections of every 6 mile by 6 mile township were given to schools in the history of the Jeffersonian land gridding. And schools use it, so that was the public funding they got. They got free land, and schools used that like an ATM machine, we would say now, like a bank. They just sold it off and used that to fund school grounds until finally they didn't have but 150,000 acres left. That's still a lot, but nothing like what they had when they were first granted 2 sections in every township. So now it's very important for schools to think about how to use that limited resource. And of course, our legislation doesn't tell anybody what to do. It only gives them an option that many have been trying to utilize and haven't been unable to use. So we'll be interested. I mean, you probably know, or a lot of people know, that the biggest indicator of student success is teacher credentialed quality teachers. So if we're losing our teachers in the state, and we're already very low in the overall public education world in terms of how much funding we give each student and what our test scores are like, I feel like the future of California is very directly tied to taking better care of our teachers and our janitors and our cafeteria workers, all the people that support the kids' education. So how much land that should be, that's a good, outstanding question. We'll see how schools approach this. The law that we passed had enough pushback that we've only put it in place for 10 years and then we'll reevaluate it. So the state legislatures had concerns, not so many that they wouldn't put it forward, but in 10 years, we'll have to take some new data and figure out how that's been used. Michael asks if there's infrastructure capable of supporting ADUs. We haven't seen enough construction of ADUs. I think the last data I saw was something like 10,000 units. Our metropolitan region has 14 million people. The city has 5 or something like that. So maybe it's more like 10, I'm sorry. So really it's back to Steve's drop in the bucket. So it hasn't pressed the infrastructure yet, but there's new legislation that built upon the ADU legislation called SB 9 that some of you may know about, which basically is allowing people to build wealth. That was your second question. How do we get it so that people can build wealth in their housing, particularly people of color, and particularly people who've been harmed by past discriminatory practices that were very specifically anti-Black, for example, and anti-Indigenous. So that's a kind of new way for cityLAB to be thinking. We tried to bake that into the education workforce housing to have some for sale units where they were targeted towards people who'd been harmed by past policies, but we couldn't get that built in all of the compromising that went on. We felt like we most importantly had to hold on to the affordability piece. But I do think, building in ways so that people can build wealth, like SB9 does, allows you to not just rent the unit behind, but to subdivide your property. So there'd be half of a piece of property that people could buy. Not going to make it cheap, but it's going to make it more affordable. And then you can build 2 units on that. So it doubled the capacity that we originally acquired through our original ADU law. Sorry, that was kind of a long-winded and circuitous answer.
So we do have another question in the chat. Where is the new hub going to be on Strathmore?
It's where parking services used to be. Many services now at UCLA, like us today, have gone remote. And I don't know if any of you was ever in Strathmore. Like if you have to get a new parking permit, it's a warren in there. So we're trying to recover it as a really pleasurable, joyful space for basic needs students. And it'll be right on the front of the parking structure 8, the Strathmore building. Yeah, so part of the new hub, if everything goes right, I was just looking at schemes that one of our student teams put together with some architects that work with us. Maybe by the end of the fall term.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, look for those pods and some polka dots. And
Okay. Another question, Victoria, you want to ask your question? Vicky?
You're mute.
Okay. It's okay. There's an
I got it. Okay,
Yeah,
just
okay.
I was wondering, Dana, if you are aware of Opportunity House on Hillgard,
amazing.
room and board. What do you think of that?
This is Sam Prater's project. It's an amazing model and is exactly what I'm talking about with this continuum of accommodation. So for those of you who don't know it, they took over a former dorm, a sorority.
Sorority, right.
Sorority. It's a beautiful house. He only has it for a limited period of time, but they are bringing foster, emancipated youth who come out of foster programs at 18 and have nowhere to go, and formerly incarcerated youth who are all going to college. They go to all different colleges, including UCLA. I think he can house maybe 35, 50. Yeah, it's about that. And it's a kind of basically new form of sorority fraternity. And it's a fantastic model. We've been there to learn from him. And I think, in light of that, his model and the co-op at UCLA are really outliers that present real opportunities as prototypes. So what we learned from the co-op students is that it costs 1/3 the price to live in a co-op as a 3-person dorm room. And what you do for that is work for 4 hours. And it's an amazing opportunity for providing less expensive housing for those students who want in. So more options, more affordability, more flexibility, all of that, like Opportunity House, is just where we should be headed.
Where is the co-op?
It's in Westwood, in the student housing area.
Oh, okay.
There's only one at UCLA. At Berkeley, there's, I don't know, 6 or 7, I think. So we haven't really generated a culture of co-ops, and it's a little bit funky. So not every student wants that, but they don't have to be.
Well, thank you for that information about Opportunity House, because it's not clear from the website that they are reaching out to formerly incarcerated people or whatever, are emancipated, but they do. It is a dry house, I noticed.
Yes.
And they have, they provide all meals.
Yeah.
And,
Everybody works.
and
It's a
social
tight ship.
workers. Who's the person who runs this?
Sam Prater. He's a genius.
Who is he?
Well, he's good. I think he worked in nonprofit housing and then found that he could lead this new initiative, and he's actually spreading it to other sites. So it's been super successful. He's attracted a lot of donor funding, which helps keep it going. And I don't know that they advertise who their students are because,
Oh, right.
you know, Holmby Hills hasn't been, in my mind, a very friendly neighbor. And Holmby Hills feels the same about us, that we haven't been a very friendly neighbor at UCLA. So
For anybody
Yeah.
who's interested in, just kind of spotting this, it's kind of across from Myra Hershey Hall. It's kind of lower down on Hillgard. So very interesting and relatively new.
I think it's been there a year and a half, not long
Okay.
at all.
Thank you.
So there's two more questions. Could possibly the housing school staff on campus, could that detour school shootings? Which is a very interesting thought, I guess, a food for thought.
Say that again. I'm trying to find that in the.
If school staff was housed on campus, could that detour school shootings? I'm not sure if anything can detour that besides maybe supporting more mental health issues and things like that. But yeah.
Well, that's interesting. You know, what we've heard is that about the only people that anyone's willing to have on a school campus because of terrible security fears are the school staffs themselves. I mean, we started thinking this should be for school staff and for unhoused students and, thinking of it as a more broadly based state supportive housing system, but was pretty clear no community was going to have people they didn't know living on their kids' campuses. And that's imagining that it's very close quarters. A lot of these sites are really detached, totally detached. All the ones in Los Angeles, for example, are pretty far from campus. That's been the recipe thus far. But I think it's a real possibility that you could create a kind of what used to be called defensible space by having neighbors who are actively living on sites and know each other and help take care of one another.
And then one more about these exciting, innovative ideas and improved legislation. Often in public hearings and local community meetings, how can we go about stopping the objection from homeowners and misconceptions about fear and change? Is it public outreach? Is it education? Probably a bit of both.
I think that's the $1 million question, especially with all the pressures now to build affordable housing in all of our communities, and especially in high opportunity neighborhoods that have been most effective at restricting affordable housing. And I'm sure, like you, my progressive friends who, have a long history of really being on a thoughtful and progressive side of issues are really not that interested in having affordable housing, new homeless shelters, the kind of housing that we really need to be thinking through. I think it is all of those things, but we jumped from the local to the state because we couldn't get through the loud voices that don't represent consensus, but represent political sway. So every time we would approach the city council for the ADU law, for example, there would be one wealthy homeowner or one, the AIDS Foundation, as you may know, in Hollywood has used all of its funds to fight affordable housing. I don't know how they justify that, but they do. And so they come out and fight against the very things that even their own neighbors are interested in. So because it really wasn't democratic, we jumped local to go to the state, and we've always tried to create legislation that had local customization possible so that local neighborhoods could say, we want to make sure that they're smaller units so they could be more affordable. We don't want to allow people to take down big trees while they build their secondary units, things like that. But I, at the moment, I'm flummoxed by local neighborhood opposition in a way that I haven't been in the past. And it may be that the crisis has just gotten so big that people don't see how we can make a good city and accommodate all the people who really need housing today. And that's something I think is a new phase in California history, that we're imagining we can't actually provide a dignified and decent way of living to the people who are living actually right now all around us.
Okay. Well, does it for the questions in the chat. If anyone else has a question, they can raise their hand, or we can open it up for a discussion. But this has been, a eye-opening conversation, and we're not sure what LA can do to assist the housing crisis. It's definitely crazy. I bought my house just right before the pandemic in 2019, and I couldn't afford it if I wanted to nowadays.
Crazy.
So it's ridiculous. Okay, Cornelia, you have the last question.
Since we're a retiree group and you haven't touched on it, what do you think about senior housing?
Well, I originally, in my first focus group around granny flats, they're called granny flats for a reason, realized that it was a neighborhood stabilization solution for older residents. So you buy a house, you raise your kids in it, your kids want to come back home and you don't have much space, or you've already borrowed out of your house. In Pacoima, we had a really wonderful group of older members who said, we borrowed out of our house to put our kids through college. Now we have these big mortgage payments. We're going to have to move. And really having a secondary unit was a way for them to add rent to their income, or to move into a smaller unit and rent out their original house. So it was very clearly a benefit to senior citizens who already owned homes. But senior housing has been one of the kinds of, some people call it cherry picking in the affordable housing arena. Nobody's against senior citizens. We see so much pushback about homeless housing, and often about affordable housing. But teachers, nobody complains about a teacher in their neighborhood. Nobody complains about old folks. So, seniors and retirees are actually one of the kinds of groups where different types of multifamily housing can be created and tested. So there was a time in the 70s and 80s when legislation allowed new forms of housing and care facilities. Those are the kind that we have now, abundant, or maybe not abundant enough, but many different types. And that really came from federal funding legislation that allowed testing new housing prototypes for senior citizens and older residents. So I think we stand to, I put myself in this category, be a really great test bed for this continuum of accommodation. I mean, many of us would like to live in shared housing or co-housing, where your kids could come back with their kids and have the guest room, and you could cook together when you wanted to, but have your own kitchen when you didn't. I mean, these are the kinds of models that developers don't produce. And sometimes through creative practices like cityLABs and then legislated, we can make that easier.
I would love to have cityLAB work on that.
Okay.
Because as they are, there's independent, there's assisted, and then there's, dire, nursing homes,
right.
which most of us hope never to go to. But I don't have children. I have a house, but I think it's too small to build my yard is too small for an ADU. And these continuing care communities are great, but they're expensive.
Yeah, that's right.
They're very expensive. They're lovely. I mean, I'd like to live in one, but I don't know if I could afford it. Maybe if I sell my California house and move to another part of the country, I could. But a lot of people don't have that option. Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there. I think there are lots of other models that could be developed. And I think it would be, we are an inoffensive population for the most part, us seniors.
I think we're going to see many more types, transformative types of housing evolving now, because it's so clear that the single family detached house has been environmentally destructive, and it's now not available to the very households it was meant for. That developers who've driven that model, even though we didn't fit it, are now rethinking, for profit reasons, different types of housing to build. So, you know, that our California state legislature has passed more innovative housing legislation this year than ever before. And last year, I would have said the same thing. So each year, the sort of calcified housing system has been broken down more and more. So I'm looking forward to innovative solutions like the one you're talking about.
Yeah, we should definitely have a follow-up discussion to maybe just to talk more about tiny houses, SROs, and senior housing. I know from my experience working in senior housing for a while, it's very, very unaffordable for most people. Well, thank you so much, Professor Cuff, for spending your afternoon with us. I will share the link to the website.
Thanks
so
for
that
having
when I
me.
send out the YouTube channel, the video, I'll send out the link to your cityLAB website.
Thanks.
Anything else you want to say, Michael? Oh, mute. Hang on, you're a mute. The dreaded mute.
Mute.
Thank you so much, Dana, and everyone who attended today. We appreciate all your time and energy. Just keep it going, okay?
Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
And keep safe.